This is Five Places, Los Angeles, a podcast by the LA Forum for Architecture and Urban Design. I'm Emmanuelle Bourrier, and I'm thrilled to be interviewing Sam Lubell about the 5 places that define Los Angeles for him. Sam Lubell is the executive editor of Metropolis magazine. He has authored more than 10 books about architecture and has written articles for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Wallpaper, Dwell, Wired, Architectural Record, and many other publications. He has co-curated a number of exhibitions, including Never Built New York, Never Built Los Angeles, and Shelter, Rethinking How We Live in Los Angeles. He has taught as an adjunct professor at Syracuse University School of Architecture and Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture Planning and Preservation. Please check the show notes for Sam's full bio and for links to the many places that are referenced in our conversation. Well, thank you, first of all, for taking the time. And I am thrilled
my pleasure.
to be doing this with you, and very eager to learn about how you see Los Angeles.
Yeah, I'm still learning myself.
Oh, that's the beauty of it, right? I think we all are. So, and this is a question, although we are friends, I don't actually know the answer to this one, which is how long have you lived in LA?
Good question. I'm still trying to figure that out too. There's a lot of math involved. Off and on, almost 10, I'd say about 10 years. Last time I was in LA, which was between 2006 and 2015, I believe. So that was about 9 years. And now I got here this March. So it's then it's only been about 8 months or so, but 7 months. Actually, no, wait, March. So yeah, not even. Wow, it fees longer.
Well, you have a newborn, so time has no more meaning for you.
No time, no memory. All trying to keep it together. So yeah, about 10 years total.
10 years. And what brought you to LA? I guess both times.
So yeah, I'm learning just from doing this. I'm learning about myself and learning about what I'm interested in and why I go places. Both times it was going with a significant other, which often brings us to new places.
Yes.
So back in 2006, it was my girlfriend. We're no longer together, but she wanted to move out, and I had been in New York for a while and was sort of excited to try a new place. And then I got before I left an offer to work at the Architects newspaper as their West Coast editor. That helped. And so I said, yeah, I'd like to. LA seems like a really fascinating, interesting place, totally different from New York. And I don't know if I'm going to like it, but I'll do it. Stayed, as I mentioned, till about 2015. And then this time, again, it was a girl. It was my wife, Barbara. And she wanted to move back. She was sort of over New York. She'd been there for a long time. And she wanted to be closer to family. And we were about to have our child, Milton. And so we decided to move back. And that was in March. So, and I've lived on the east side for my first stint. And now I'm on the west side. So, still getting to know everything I can.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I can relate, actually. I came out for a man. So, I moved to LA the first time for love also, and somewhat more reluctantly than you're putting it, actually, because after living in New York, people in New York, the way they talked about LA really made me a little wary of moving to LA.
Yeah.
But the love story was more important than the city to me at the time. And I didn't expect to fall completely in love with LA the way I have.
Yeah, it's not the kind of place on the surface you think you might. I think it takes a lot of time and some digging. And I think people's attitudes in New York have changed about LA. I'm not sure when you moved there, but I think people were even harder on it. And then they've sort of, I think people seem to like it. And a lot more New Yorkers have moved to LA.
Right.
I think there's like everybody in New York's like, wait a minute, everybody's in LA now.
This was 1999.
Yeah. So, and mine was 03, and I felt the same excuse me, '06. I felt the same, that people were still pretty negative about it, or sort of just mystified by it.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's the kind of place that took me at least a year to really figure out where I was even going,
Yeah.
and where things were, and yeah, it just takes time. New York is much quicker as far as you just kind of get it. It's a much more, and it's just understood by so many people, and yeah, it's just a different, very, very different as far as getting to know and getting to love the place. It just takes a lot longer.
It's so true. And it's so worth it.
It is
There's
worth it.
there's a real sense of satisfaction after you start to get a sense of it and start to discover it. And then, I don't think you ever quite figure it out.
No, because it's almost, there is no LA. Like, it's not like, everybody's LA is so different. It's like a region more than a city. And it's definitely, a totally different kind of concept as far as where you live. And so, yeah, to say like, this is LA, it's just different for everybody.
Right. Hence this podcast.
And this podcast, somebody should do a podcast about that.
So that may be a good segue into asking you, what are the 5 places that define the city
Sure.
for you?
And it's really, as I mentioned, I think it's a good topic. I think it really got me thinking about, it's not just like, what are your favorite places? Like, what are cool places to go? It's like, yeah, but what defines LA? And although a lot of these places are some of my favorite places, but I do think they're places that when I start to think about why, which I don't usually think about that too much, it really does start to elucidate what is special about LA, and what are things about LA that are unique. Yeah, so the first one on my list, and you'll see that my list has a lot of architecture and a lot of food, which those are important things to me.
Absolutely. Perfect.
Sometimes they combine. So the first one that came to mind was a place that actually no longer exists, but it's called Bahuka, and it was all the way out in West Covina. It was a restaurant. It was a tiki restaurant, and it closed, I don't know, probably about 8 years ago. Not super long ago, maybe a little more. But it was a fantastic, incredible, one of these incredible only in LA places. And because it's more than a restaurant. It's sort of like, whoever the owners, it was a family that owned it. Basically, I guess the name was a Navy veteran. Name is Jack Fleigel. It's like an art project. It's like an outsider art project, and a restaurant, and a show, and more than a restaurant for sure. So Bahuka was a tiki restaurant, and they opened first in one location, and they moved to this location on Rosemead in West Covina. West Covina is an interesting place, by the way. That's a whole other topic. It's basically, it's a giant tiki restaurant, and all the walls were made out of fish tanks. So they had over 100 fish tanks in there. So it's basically like walking into like the Little Mermaid or something. It's like walking into the ocean. It's incredible. I mean, like, you go outside, you park in the parking lot. There's like an old, Navy cannon in there, and you're like, ooh. And it does have shades of like Disney, and like walking into a different world. As soon as you get in there, it's dark. It's got, tiki paraphernalia covering all the walls, which is, normal for tiki bars, which I love in LA, just in general.
Yeah.
But then it's like a warren of rooms, so you don't really get a sense of the whole place. Like, you go in little tunnels or curving areas, and just fish everywhere. And there was a giant fish, famous fish because it's LA, named Rufus, and he was huge. I think it was a pachu, if that's right, fish, and he was famous for eating carrots. Carrots, apparently. I never saw him eat a carrot, but I did see him every time I went. But and so, yeah, and he was, I think it's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. He appeared. The place appeared.
Oh, okay.
Because that's another thing about LA places, is they're often appearing in movies.
Yeah.
So I have seen the movie, but I found this out just now recently, and so I have to rewatch the movie and see if I can find Bahuka and hopefully Rufus in it. So yeah, I think it's these kinds of places that are labors of love, and they're not art in any way that you would think of art, but they really are art, and they're sort of, not part of the establishment, what they think of as art. They're not, the most famous in LA, the most famous example of that is obviously, I think, Watts Towers. And that was something that, Simon Rudia worked on for his whole life, putting in mosaics and building these amazing towers. But those kinds of things are everywhere in LA.
Yeah.
There's one near us that I only seen from the outside here in Santa Monica that I never knew about. It's completely covered with tiles. I think it's called the Farnham House. There's Slab City and Salvation Mountain out near the Salton Sea. These things are everywhere, and it really is kind of the spirit of LA, is like this remnant of beyond Wild West. Like this is the end of the world, and we're going to try whatever we want, and we're not. It's sort of in a lot of ways the blessing and the curse of LA, and it's why it's so amazing. It's why it's kind of so ugly. It's why it's the rules don't apply, which definitely has its pros and cons, but the pros are big pros. And people that can't or don't feel emboldened to do things like this in other places, I think they feel like that more here. And I don't know if that spirit is starting to lessen as it gets more and more expensive. I think it may be, but it's still there. It's still there.
That kind of like freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or what is it? Yeah. The LA is when the whole country got shaken on its end and everything just wound up there. Yeah, all those things are true. I think.
Everything loose lands in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I think that's true. So Bahuka is definitely, I wish I could recommend it as a place to visit. I recommend looking it up because there's still stuff about it. Apparently Rufus, I was trying to figure out if where they moved him to, and it's like this mystery, and the people that bought the place were supposed to take care of him. But so if anybody hears what happened to Rufus, let me know. I'd like to know. And there's still just amazing tiki bars everywhere in LA, and that's just an amazing California. I mean, it's all over the country, obviously, but that really kind of made its way from Hawaii, from servicemen coming from Hawaii, and then starting up this whole concept, in Southern California, or all over California. So that's an amazing thing too. Possibly seen as offensive now because you're appropriating Polynesian culture, and there's an aspect of that, but I think now it's like, if you have a tiki place, you're not doing that. You're sort of taking over a tradition that maybe at one point did that. And I think it's an amazing thing.
Wow. Well, we'll put out the question to the internet about Rufus.
Yeah, where's Rufus?
Somebody knows where Rufus is.
Yes, I would love to know.
Hopefully he's getting his fill of carrots.
Yes, I hope so too. So that's one. Number two, as I mentioned, a lot of restaurants here. But for me, one of my favorite restaurants, and it's in, there's a couple locations, but the one that I really got to know was in Little Armenia, which before I moved to LA, I did not know existed. And it's called Carousel, incredible Armenian restaurant east of Hollywood. Just really ugly strip mall after strip mall, and amazing food and places inside them, which again is, I think, an amazing LA thing.
That to me is so typical of LA. Amazing food in strip malls.
Yeah. I once heard a story about that. Yeah, it's like high-end restaurants in strip malls. Okay,
I'll link to the story.
Yeah. It's sort of, I mean, it is like an LA typology, not just the strip mall, but doing amazing things in strip malls.
Right.
It is an LA thing to sort of not be offended by that. I think New Yorkers, I think the sensibilities have changed to some extent. I think people would be more open to that now, especially, with irony and everything. But I think that's a real LA thing. And Carousel is just, it's an example of, I didn't know there was a Little Armenia, and the food. The first time I went there, we had this incredible meal. It was so good. It was so filling. I was so full. And then they're like, okay, here comes the next course. I was like, what? There's more? And it was like, then it's like the entree, it's more food than you could ever eat. It's almost like everybody's eyes bulge out when the rest comes. So it's like these experiences, and the fact that, because I think New York has always been known as like the melting pot city, but I think a lot of those ethnic areas have sort of, especially in Manhattan, sort of gone away again because of gentrification and the cost of living. And in LA, at least for now, they're still really very, very strong. I was just, going through in my head, there's Thai Town, there's Little Armenia, Koreatown is like the size of most cities. There's Little Tokyo. There's Chinatown, but Arcadia and Alhambra are just massive, massive populations of Chinese folks. And, the East LA is just an incredible place to go. South LA has incredible cultural, amazing food and culture there. So just the way the cultures break down here is fascinating. And you could also make the argument, well, yeah, it's also kind of segregated. And I think that's to some extent partially true too. LA is not a very integrated place, in my opinion. And that's changing for sure. That's one of the good changes. But on the flip side, you have these amazing enclaves of just incredible culture and, strong communities. I love that about LA, and I look forward to finding more areas I didn't know existed and just exploring them.
Yeah, so, one of my other podcast guests was Suri Hong, who's Vietnamese, and she talked about Little Saigon in Westminster. You can look at it as segregated, but you can also say, like, to her, that's where she goes where she wants to feel like she's home.
Right.
So, she knows she can go there and that everything that she sees and hears and smells will remind her of home.
Right. And it really, there's something about, and also just kind of the scale of a lot of these places. It's not just like Koreatown in New York is like one block, basically, or 2 blocks. Whereas here it's a city, and it feels like there's a concentration that it's enough that you can sort of feel like you're like, wait, did I just go into another country? Like, did I just transport into Korea? Because, and also just the urbanism there, like they have restaurants stacked on top of each other. It's like, it becomes a place that is like a hybrid place. It's not just like a Koreatown morphed onto like streets in New York. It's like, no, this is from scratch, its own kind of place. And that's interesting too. And in places like, Thai Town, Little Armenia, like some of the urbanistically less attractive places are usually almost always the more interesting places to go culturally and food wise. And just, I kind of love that about LA. It's like, it's almost like your first impression, like you have to lead into going into places that don't look like places you necessarily think you would want to go. And then it turns out those are almost always the most interesting places and the richest places. So places where people can open up a restaurant. It's not a huge barrier to entry, and there's people can experiment, and there's just a lot. It's just fascinating. So 3 is sort of a hybrid. This goes along with my favorite places, and I think the places that define LA. I was going to say Griffith Park because I spent a lot of time there, and then I was going to say Elysian Park because I lived on the east side for a long time. I haven't gotten to know, honestly, the west side very well, also because we have a new kid, a new baby. So I've gotten to know like the 2 blocks around my house really well, but maybe less so. And Griffith was the one that was the place I went to the most, but actually the most weirdly LA place, or one of them, was in Elysian Park. So interesting. I love Elysian Park. It's also less crowded than Griffith Park, and feels much more like you're removed from the city, even though you're like even closer to downtown. You're just basically over the hill from downtown, and it's got its own sordid history, but that's another episode. So you're walking on this path in the middle of nowhere, and then you look down and there's this like pool, and there's like these rock gardens, and then I found out later that's like it's LA Police Academy has like a training center there in the middle of this like bucolic thing with these palm trees and and these patches of beautiful green grass like overlooking the hills and stuff. yeah, so there's this weird, the police academy is there, and then over the hill is Dodger Stadium. And I love the parts of LA where, living the dream of LA, which is to be in the country when you're, literally 5 minutes from like really, really dense urban fabric. And those areas are also few and far between. There are not enough of them, and they're, concentrated often in the wealthier areas. And that's a whole other story, but they're wonderful. They're, I love urban parks, but I also love parks like Griffith and Elysian, which are rustic parks. And you're hiking. You're not like, on a quad or a green, looking at buildings. You're literally in, nature. And that is an amazing thing. And but you're in nature and you're staring at the rest of the city. And there's that combination of not being completely removed, which is what makes those places, I think, so special too.
So is Elysian Park where you would go to hike and
walk? Yeah, definitely. I mean, Griffith, my favorite hike was not the one at the observatory because it's more crowded, but it's the one behind the tennis courts there, Vermont Canyon, and just stunning and beautiful and not too crowded, and just, beautiful views of the city. And rarely anybody, you're not crowded at all. It's not like, Runyon, and each one of these canyons has its own scene. Runyon is like everybody dresses up and goes on dates. And but I really do like, kind of like beaches too. If you can find ones that are not crowded, they're always the best, because like you want to be in nature to the extent that you can, I think, or I do. But they're always connected in some ways, sometimes really weird, and Elysian is the other one. Yeah, like I said, that I went to, and you totally feel removed. But then you go over a hill and then you're overlooking, the 5 freeway, and it's like right there. But on the other side, you can't even hear it. And even when you can hear it, you're still in a bucolic setting, and you're overlooking, in that case, you're overlooking the San Gabriel Mountains. And I believe, just this interesting mix of weird, urban and rural, and not in ways that you see in many places anywhere. The next one, so I wanted to certainly do architecture, and I wanted to talk about modernist architecture, since I've written a lot about modernism. I've done a couple of books, a couple of guides on that topic. And originally I was going to do a house that's not original. And it's so unoriginal that one of your amazing guests has already done it, the Stahl House. That actually got me thinking about another project, which I think is even kind of more interesting. And it's not mid-century modern, it's like late modern architecture. And it's the Bonaventure Hotel, John Portman.
Yeah.
And that's just an amazing place. It really, it's late modern architecture, so it's very corporate meets space age. And you've got these glass elevators running up, along the sides and outside, kind of shooting up over as you go up, it shoots out of the building essentially towards the revolving restaurant. And when you're inside, it feels like you're in this Tron or something, the space age city, cavernous kind of spaces that really do feel sort of like you're in a city connected by these glass cylinders, which feels like you're totally on some sort of space deck. So it really is. I think it's stepping out. When you're inside, you're stepping out into a different time and a different world. You're in like the 70s version of like sci-fi view of sci-fi. And Portman was famous for making these sort of spaces, hotels that felt like they were cities, like an urban planning, basically inside lobbies of buildings. And in some ways also it's like a way to not go outside, because cities weren't doing as well, especially downtown LA was not doing so well. So that's sort of the negative side, or maybe not negative, just the reality of when it was done. But now it's still an important part of downtown LA, and it's connected to other places by these weird raised pedestrian bridges, and that feels like an otherworldly thing, which in theory I don't like, because I like being down on the street in cities. But in this case, because it's like this quirky exception, I love it. And I love walking along those bridges and seeing the city in a different way. I think that's a fantastic building.
I told you that I interviewed my son for the very first Five Places interview just to kind of do a practice run. And also, I thought it would be fun. And he mentioned
Oh, he did.
riding those elevators
Yes, they're great.
because that is just, it's such a thrill. Like,
Yeah,
especially when well, I was going to say, especially when you're a kid, but honestly, I think probably for all of us,
yeah, yeah.
it's a
It's
lot.
like
That's
it's better than Disney. It's incredible. Well, Disney's awesome. It's better than the elevator rides at Disney, like the Tower of Terror, or whatever. I think the Bonaventure is better. Just that the Willy Wonka glass elevator thing, and then it glides so smoothly. But then that point where you're in the building and then you're out of the building, and then you feel
yeah,
like you're in a spaceship, like you're taking off. It's just incredibly well choreographed. Yeah, they're
yeah,
fantastic.
amazing.
And I certainly think that the Bonaventure, it's so under the radar in a weird way too. It's just this
Mhm.
incredible thing that if you ask, I think 9 out of 10 people in LA probably wouldn't even know what it was. But when it first opened, it was a big deal.
Do you know what year it opened?
I think it was 76, which is when I was born. I
Oh,
think that's when it was.
oh,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So I have that connection too.
Yeah, that's great. And downtown LA would have been just so different then.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I kind of wish I would like to see it, to experience it downtown LA. It's just strange and typically incomprehensible place that I really do like, but it's not normal as
Right.
downtowns go.
Right.
And that part of downtown, Bunker Hill is just although it's down the hill, but it's part of, Bunker Hill. It's
Mhm.
just so it is artificial, built on a neighborhood that got torn down, and then they built all these
Mhm.
high rises, and it feels weird. And they're trying to make something out of it, which is slowly happening. But that's sort of the lesson, is that Grand Avenue, they're putting one thing after another, but it's not going to become a neighborhood right away. For a neighborhood to really become like a real neighborhood, probably going to take more than half a century before it even starts to feel kind of worth going to. It's
Yeah.
because one thing will never do it, like putting in Disney Hall is a step, but it doesn't do it. Putting in the Broad, okay, it's a step, and there's a restaurant. Okay, okay, now we've got the Grand, and okay, so some wealthy people living there and some shopping. No, that's not going to do it. But together, and fits and starts and process of elimination and evolution. Eventually, you get something, I think, and some things don't make it, some do. I think that can take up to a century, really. It just takes some time. I mean, some places are easier than others, like the Arts District. When
Mhm.
I first came to LA, there was nothing.
Right.
It's like Syark and maybe a couple of places, a couple of bars, but and that fairly quickly, once it opened up, sort of turned into a neighborhood that feels like a place you want to go. Some places do take a little. It's still developing, and it's not a mature place yet, but it's definitely it's interesting to see how some things take off quicker than others.
It is. And LA really is such a young city.
Yeah, yeah, I love seeing pictures of most of LA in the 30s, or just like fields,
Yeah.
anything west of, like, I don't know, La Brea. It's just crazy to see. I mean, Santa Monica, where I am, was older, but like there's just these huge gaps, and like San Pedro, Palos Verdes was in Long Beach was developed, but then in between there's nothing. And I love that about LA, is that it's still like a teenager as cities go. It's
Yeah.
in its awkward teenager stage.
Puberty. Yeah.
It's going through puberty.
It's emo phase, maybe, or yeah, it's finding itself somewhere.
It's yeah. So the last one, oh, okay. So the last place was that I thought about was the Magic Castle in Hollywood. And it's not just because it's just an amazing place to visit and fun, and you see weird magic shows, but it's very much also an architecture thing. It's one of the most transporting places I've ever been to. because architecture, it's like the chateau style, which is also a weird thing in LA because there are no chateaus in LA, obviously.
There's
But
Marmont, Chateau Marmont.
yes, no, I mean they're chateaus. They're just not.
But you mean an actual
They're just
chateau?
yeah, exactly. It's not
Yes.
like yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. They're chateaus that are designed after other chateaus, obviously. But then you walk in and it's also just weird because it's a magic place, and like who goes to a place that's just for magic? Like I don't think there's anywhere else like that I know of anywhere in the world. I'm sure there is, but I don't know them. The way it's designed, the decor inside, you feel like you're in like just a different era. Also, not the same era as the outside. You're in like maybe like the 20s or 30s, and you're in this old dining club, which also feels weird and stuffy in a weird way, but not like too stuffy. But different rules about how you behave yourself and you dress, and then just weird thing, not just the shows, but all the cool things on the walls. And the first time I went there was on like, it was like a weird treasure hunt that somebody put together. So then you're really exploring all the weird nooks and crannies of the place. And so it combines a lot of, combines sort of like the Hollywood that sort of pervades a lot of places, and like really cool restaurants that sort of still have that Hollywood vibe. Like in Hollywood, the Musso and Frank's kind of has that.
Yeah.
Kind of they're restaurants, again, they're restaurants, but they're also sort of like a set almost, it feels like, or it's you're in a movie.
And all those places, we're in LA, which is like blindingly sunny most of the time. And all those places to me feel like these dark kind of velvety, I don't know. It's the opposite of being outside in LA, basically.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's why you wouldn't have a chateau in LA. It's like they're built to like block out most of the, it's like cold and rainy and all things that LA are not.
Right.
And you have big velvet curtains and no, you're totally removed. You're right about that from the outside, and it does feel like a stage set. I guess places like Clifton's kind of has that, or the Dresden in Los Feliz, like they all have this sort of surreal, which I love. I love that kind of theatricality to places. I think a lot of that is left over from Hollywood, old Hollywood, which had a lot more of it. You think about like the Ambassador Hotel, and you think about all these places, the Brown Derby, that like it was just everywhere, and just sort of Hollywood pervading. And I think that's great. I think that creativity is still in LA and still comes out in places like that. And sometimes like the Magic Castle, it's really, really weird, but I love it. And I'm not a huge magic fan. Like I like magic, but I wouldn't like, if it were anywhere else, I wouldn't be like, oh, let's go watch magic show at like Hollywood Bowl, or it's like I'm not that into magic, but it's the experience. It just brings up so much like the architecture that doesn't fit. That's so cool, like the chateau style, like kind of that misfit quality of so much of LA architecture, of LA places. I just love the creativity and the weirdness, and we could go on forever and ever about the weirdness, but it's amazing that way. It's totally worth going to. It's totally worth going to. It's like it's a mind blank, it really is one of those kinds of places.
Well, I'm letting this kind of sink in, and I want to throw another question or two at you.
Yeah.
Just because so I was flipping through Neverbuilt right before we got on. I was just flipping through and looking at some of the projects and the intro. And so, I mean, you've written the book on architecture that was never built in LA. And is there I have two questions about it. First of all, is there one project in here that you just think, well, if that project had been built, it would have had the biggest impact on Los Angeles, like making it different from what it is today?
Right.
That's probably
there's a lot,
because there are a lot of projects in here.
Yeah, and there are a number that would have kind of shifted the whole concept of LA in a way, but they're obviously bigger projects mostly. Probably the biggest 1922. Sorry to not narrow it down, but there was a plan in the 1920s to build subways in LA. A firm called Kelker and DeLue came up with a legitimate plan to build hundreds of miles of subway in the city. We did get a subway, but not until like the 1980s. And by then it was really too little too late, in a lot of ways, to really have it be a working kind of effective alternative. And people in the city turned it down because they didn't want to have LA be like a Chicago or New York. They wanted the freedom of the car. They didn't want elevateds, and they didn't want all the things they didn't like about subways.
Right.
But if you think about how that would have changed, not just how we would have gotten around, and it wouldn't be the only alternative, nor is it in New York, but it would have been a major alternative. But it would have changed how the city developed in a major way, because you inevitably develop on transit lines, and you would have had probably a slightly, a denser fabric from the beginning and a little less sprawl. And because cars being the dominant feature, everything was built not just spaced out to be, but built to be seen by cars. Like the car just changed everything. So if you have more of a balance of transit, it's not just about how you get around, it's how the place is spaced, it's how the architecture is formed, everything is formed around that. So that's just like kind of mind-boggling to think if that had happened. And then another plan was a plan by Frederick Law Olmsted's sons for parks. The Chamber of Commerce hired them to come up with a proposition for a ring of parks, sort of like the Emerald Necklace in Boston. Basically would have, LA is still I think per capita the most park poor. I was alluding to that before. It's incredibly low because the idea was like you would have your own yard, or in some way you wouldn't depend on these huge rings of parks, and developers were running the show, and that didn't help either. And that was why this plan died. It was the Chamber of Commerce that hired them, and then when this came out, they kind of made it go away very quickly. So you would have had huge parks. You would have had many more parkways, which are sort of the precursors to highways, tree line, and there are some, especially like in Palos Verdes, but like, tree lined and park lined. There's several in New York too, that Moses built, actually, ironically, before he started building highways that tank through neighborhoods. There were parkways, which were much more humane. So you would have had those, you would have had huge parks, you would have had, opened up a lot, many miles of coastline just for recreation, many more than are open. Just the conception of the city would have been very different, not a private oriented place. The way housing would have been different because you don't have to have that yard, or you don't necessarily have to have that yard. The way things are oriented, the way transit happens, it's just like a domino effect of what you think the impacts could be, and just the way people see each other and the public interacts, and just on and on and on. So I think those are the two big. There's many more.
There's a lot of injustice in both of those, social injustice.
Yeah.
In the fact that neither of those projects happened.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. LA, the way it's laid out and the way it's designed is not, it's known as a liberal place now, but it really wasn't, when it was being developed. And it was specifically designed in ways that were not needless to say of all the, the covenants and everything else, but in almost every way, it was not a very progressively designed city. So it's interesting that now you have a very progressive population that's sort of like jerry-rigged into a place that wasn't designed for progressiveness. So it's sort of like, how do you carve that out in it? And the government is also, well, that's another story, but not designed for massive change. It's better designed for things not moving.
Yes. And when we were talking about the subway, you said people wanted the freedom of the car, right? And when you said the word freedom, I heard air quotes around it, because, I know why people think of the car as giving them freedom, but at the same time, now it doesn't give everybody that freedom, because not everyone can afford a car, especially now that we're all tethered to the gas pump, or those of us who don't have electric cars yet, at least. And I remember being in New York and when I lived there, the subway was so freeing. because you could just hop on the subway and it would take you anywhere in the city.
Yeah.
Love it or hate it. It was always running late, and there was never an express when you needed one, or, or there was one when you didn't want one.
Yeah. It was seen as freedom, and now it's often seen as not freedom. And
Right.
it's funny how conceptions of things changed so dramatically. And it's not seen as freedom for reasons you're saying, because of traffic and because of just feeling like you have no choice and you're sort of stuck in your car, which is very rarely a nice, really great experience nowadays. The other thing you said as well is, not everybody can afford it. So if you're building a city and not everybody can get around in it, it's obviously not not a free place for a lot of people. And especially when there is public transit, but it's not necessarily very efficient still. There are a lot of buses, but it's not an efficient system. And for this scale of the place and what needs to be done, it's not. I don't think it's there yet. So yeah, it's not really seen as freedom anymore. That's true. Yeah. It's a lesson in what do we think of now as freedom, and things that are going to change for the better. It's like not everything will change for the better. Every invention, every technology has its pros and its cons. Like, oh, social media, it's a great thing. It's opening us up.
Right.
Oh, there's some cons.
Oh, wait.
Okay. Oh, maybe not.
That's very true. One more question about Never Built.
Yeah.
So, because Never Built came out 13 years ago, right? I think. Or no, I'm sorry, not 13. It was 2013. So
yeah.
Never Built came out almost 10 years ago. And you say in the intro, you talk about how Los Angeles is this place of incredible creativity and ingenuity and imagination, and yet there aren't really any civic projects that reflect that, at least not yet, and that a lot of them were planned but never built. And do you feel like there's anything that's been built in the last 10 years that has started to change that? Is there anything like really imaginative? And
good question.
And I am putting you on the spot. I was reading it and I almost texted you. So if you want to
no, it's good. It's good. I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think since we wrote Never Built, I've gotten to, and I've worked on books about the modernist legacy in LA. And I think I would temper my statement that there are none, or our statement, I should say, Greg Golan and I's statement, because there are some that are pretty remarkable, but whether they rise to the level of civic kind of, I'm trying to think, like City Hall in LA, I think is pretty remarkable. Not that it's modernist, but it's a pretty remarkable civic building. And I think the Music Center, in some ways, just giving examples of buildings that they're pretty remarkable, but they're not, they don't raise to the level of some of the landmarks around the world necessarily as, great civic landmarks and great buildings that sort of changed architecture in cities. Whether that's happening now or has happened, it's a really good question. I think there's some really good things that have been built. I think the Broad, for example, in downtown LA is a really good building with some literal cracks, some issues. Interesting experience of art. I think the way you move through it, I think the way the light comes in, I think the way that it relates to the street, which is still a weird street, and the way that it's, built in this little green space and a restaurant that I think is great. I wish there were some less expensive restaurants so more people could enjoy it. And also just there'd be more activity on the street. But I think that's a really good building. But whether it's like a game changer kind of building, I don't think it is. I think it's a really good museum. But I don't think it's a game changer as far as something that really, I think Disney Hall was a game changer.
Yeah.
Because for better or worse, it was something that just changed architecture. Just the way that you could, it's sort of, I see it as a piece with the Guggenheim in Bilbao, because it's sort of like even more extreme version of the Guggenheim in Bilbao as far as just the flourishes and the theatricality. I think that type of architecture is now on the way out. That sort of flashy Guggenheim effect architecture. But I do think it's remarkable of a time and sort of changed things. I don't think I can think of anything civic that reaches that level. I think the 6th Street Viaduct that we just completed, it has the potential to do that. It's not done yet, because what's interesting about that project is the park space that's going to be underneath it and all the parks attached to it, and the kind of idea of experience a bridge and making it a public space and a civic space. That's really interesting, but we won't know for another like 3 years till everything grows in and everything is completed. I think it's a cool bridge, but it's not a game changer unless that, happens. And then it changes the dynamic of how people experience infrastructure, and how they experience cities. And I think that could be a game changer.
I'm very optimistic about that. I'm looking forward to seeing it evolve. I think it has. It's an amazing project.
Yeah.
Exciting.
I still having a park underneath the bridge, like, I guess they're going to have to work out the fumes and the sort of that kind of thing. I'm sure they have, or they will. And also it's just, you're in a totally unsheltered area there. So the sun beating on you, you have to, that's something that they have to contend with. But again, it's still a work in progress. So there is a lot of potential, and it does, I agree with you, have the potential to be a game-changing kind of piece of civic architecture, for sure. I don't know. I'm curious. Have you seen anything that you think is kind of that level of architecture?
The only thing I could really think of was the 6th Street Bridge.
Yeah.
Maybe SoFi. I mean, there's something pretty great about the SoFi Stadium. I was there for an AIA event. So there was literally an awards ceremony happening on one level. And then down on the field, there was like, I want to say it was a Little League game. Like, these were kids. Sorry, I've got my sports mixed up. Little League is baseball, right?
Yeah.
Soccer. Okay.
I'm so spaced, I didn't even notice. Like, Little League soccer.
There was a youth soccer game going on. And it was just beautiful because there were kids playing soccer and their parents cheering them on in this huge, beautiful stadium that I can imagine that as a kid, it would be really exciting to play there. And then meanwhile, on another level, there was this whole architecture party happening, and it felt really alive. And like there were a lot of different people enjoying the building in different ways.
Yeah, that's great. Great example.
It's a good building. What I'm not so sure about is how you get to it. Do you have to drive and deal with the parking? Or is there a better way to get to it? Because that would make it even better.
I think you nailed it. And I have not, I'm embarrassed to say, been there, because I've written about it. And I've interviewed a lot of people about it and done virtual tours of it, but I've not been there. But I think I think that's a great example. I think it does have it does have potential, and it's still in progress to be a game changer because of the way it relates to the space around it, with the parks that Mia Lair worked on, and the fact that it's so multi-use inside. So it's not just people going for that. There's other things going on which can make it into sort of a kind of a more civic, almost urban feeling. So I still have to go, but I think it potentially can be. And I think what you said about the transit, from what I understand, is exactly the problem. There's supposed to be eventually a connector from the subway. There's going to be like a multimodal transit stop. But we'll see. I mean, it's getting in and out of any stadium is such a disaster that if they can figure that one out, we'll give them a lot of props. And again, because the transit is not the default, it's harder in LA, but I'll give them some potential. We'll see how it goes. It's also a few years off.
Right, exactly. It takes time. I mean, I would love to see a building like that has so much passion and creativity and expertise poured into it, and it becomes this really quite amazing piece of architecture. I would just love to see it be as well used and well loved as possible.
Yeah.
To even expand the programming that more and more things happen there so that all different kinds of people can use it and can access it. I
That would
think
be
that
wonderful.
would be beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, there are some plans to do a little of that, but you're right. That would be fantastic because there aren't spaces like that, enough spaces like that in LA, and it has like the opportunity to fill a huge kind of void.
I think about the Centre Pompidou in Paris a lot. I think about how that building it's an incredible piece of architecture. It's right in the middle of the city. You can take the subway to it, you can walk to it. It's very accessible. And they have all this amazing art in there that you can go and see, but there's, well, the restaurant's a little pricey. When I was a kid, they didn't have a pricey restaurant. It was very democratic getting around there. And, there's a library. Like I used to go and study there when I lived nearby.
Oh yeah, Kandinsky Library. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, like to me, that is such a fantastic building because so many different people use it in different ways. And it's visually extraordinary. And the experience of using it is extraordinary.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's so diverse and it advertises that because from the outside, it's like it literally a jumble. All the pipes on the outside, it's just like, we're going to turn everything you know about a building on its head.
And the escalator. So you literally see people
right
going up into it. And those people have this incredible view over the city.
But it's amazing because you see all that activity in that plaza. Everybody, it's a very urban plaza. I mean, they did rip up a lot of the city to do that.
Yes. And people hated it at first.
Yeah.
It was very controversial.
Yeah. But in a city, activity, people there, as much energy, I think more energy, the better. And it makes me wonder, now I'm going back to LA, but one place that had that, which they're sort of tinkering with, and maybe it could be, it's a place that could be a game changer, and it could be something that's really a big mistake, which is LACMA, the Zumthor. Because LACMA, sort of almost by accident, because it's been like Frankenstein from one thing to the next, but it has that kind of energy, and it still does to some extent. I think what Renzo Piano did with the kind of plaza and the kind of the way you walk through is still really effective in the way they put in the lights. But that second plaza, it felt very urban and it felt very unique and weird, like LA does, and smashed together like LA does. And now they want to do this kind of beautiful, quiet, well, not quiet, but beautiful, kind of like raised above the city kind of thing. And in theory, it could be something that doesn't feel LA. It feels like the art world to me feels like its own country, and it feels like you're going to that art world versus like going to LA. And that's, I think, could be a big mistake. But if they activate underneath it in ways that I sort of hear buzzing about, like there is some potential, but it can't be just like this raised art thing. It's got to be something that's part of LA, like Pompidou. Like, yes, they tore out this piece of the city, and they probably wouldn't do that again. But this is at a time when they were doing that. But the way they filled it is very urbane and effective, and they have to think about that here.
Yeah,
Paris is such a walkable place already, and that area of Paris is like literally the center, so it's a good place to do it. But it works well.
Yeah, it's not really fair to compare Paris to LA.
But if you're going to do that in LA, I mean, LACMA, for better or worse, is kind of the center.
I think it's a really
more than downtown is. Downtown is like an end, whereas mid-city that's the middle, really, of the way the city is kind of developed.
But I do think it's an interesting exercise to think, like, if there were something like Pompidou in LA, how could that actually happen, or what would that be?
Yeah, you can't put down something that's really urban if the area around it isn't urban. And again, LACMA has the subway's coming there eventually. Like, it has the potential to be a center of the city. But we'll see. It's really to me it's the biggest kind of wild card in the city that there is. And it could be, as I said, it could be a total positive game changer, or it could be something that's a mistake. And I don't weirdly know which thing it's going to be.
Yeah, well, Time will tell.
Yes, it's exciting. It's exciting.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, it's exciting and sad. It's a little bit of everything.
A little bit everything, yeah. I would like to ask you if there's one person whom you could ask about the 5 places that define LA for them, who would it be?
I figured I'd want to ask an architect because I'm an architecture nerd, and he lives literally around the corner from me in Santa Monica, or at least he used to, or his house is there. Frank Gehry.
Oh,
And I would be curious.
yeah,
He's seen so much, and he's had such an impact.
that would be fascinating. I would love to hear his 5 places.
Yeah, and he does get the city. I mean, he's done so much work here that nobody knows was him.
Mhm.
Like just like strip malls and like in Santa Monica, all these things that nobody ever talks about, but it was actually him.
The apartment I used to live in, where you
There
came
you
for
go, the
dinner one
apartment.
night.
There you go. So much stuff like that. Yeah,
Yeah,
which is fascinating. And he became known for this architecture that it's really like an international thing. It's not an LA thing, but he's done so much that sort of just fits with the city and morphed and changed like the city. And
yeah,
yeah, it'd be interesting to hear what he had to say.
that would be great. Shall we see if we can get him?
Yeah.
Let's do it. Let's do it. You know, Frank Gehry is from Toronto, as I am. And I can safely say I went into architecture because of him.
There you
Because
go.
when I was in high school, our art teacher took us to a Frank Gehry show at this place called the Power Plant on the lakefront in Toronto. And I was blown away and just said, whatever this is, I want to do this.
Oh, it's fate. You have to interview him. It has to happen.
Well, I think you should do the interview because he's your
Oh.
+1.
Oh, right. Okay. Okay. Well, then I'll have
but
to mention that.
but I would be honored for him to be on this podcast. Sam, thank you.
Oh, thank you. This is really fun. I think you are a great host. You've always been fun to talk to and always just sincerely interested in what people have to say. I always sense that. And so it's a great show and it's fun being part of it.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm learning as I go, but you're right. It's the curiosity that fuels me. So
Curiosity. Yeah, it's fun to learn too. It's good. It's good to do this.
To learn more about Sam Lubell's work and all the places referenced in our conversation, please check out the show notes. To hear more stories of the places that define Los Angeles, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also visit us online at 5places.la. 5 Places is produced by Annalie Garakani, Quinn Wynn, Jane Itzweiman, and me, Emmanuelle Bourlier, for the LA Forum for Architecture and Urban Design. We recorded on Chumash, Kizh, Tongva, and Mi'kmaq land. Thank you for listening.